Hello, welcome back. My name is Crystal and I love horror movies. And if you're looking for a fun, spooky, chill setting, I'm your girl. So on this channel, I do deep dives into whatever films or TV shows that we're talking about. And once you finish this episode, do all that good stuff like comment, like, share, subscribe, if you want to. So as you can tell from the title, we are going to be doing a deep dive into the 2022 film Watcher. In this film, we follow a young American woman who moves with her husband to Bucharest and begins to suspect that a stranger who watches her from the apartment building across the street may be a local serial killer decapitating women. It was directed by Chloe Akuno and it was written by Akuno and Zach Ford, and it stars Micah Monroe, Carl Glusman, and Bern Gorman. So the film starts and we are introduced to Julia and her husband Francis, who have just landed in Romania. We learn that Francis works in marketing and is being relocated to Romania for work, and the two seem to have a normal, stable relationship. And Julia tried her hand at acting, but then she gave it up. We learn that Julia is trying to learn Romanian to, of course, help with the language barrier, while her husband, Francis, is fluent. The first few nights that the couple is in the city, they come upon a crime scene of a woman who was killed in her apartment. And this is where we learn about the serial killer named the Spider, which is the name that the police have given to this serial killer who has been killing women, obviously not too far from where the couple lives. So we follow Julia through the film as she's trying to get familiar with the new city, new country, new people. She gets coffee by herself. She goes to the movies by herself. She goes grocery shopping by herself. And as she's doing all of this, she is getting the sense that someone is following her and someone is watching her. So before all of this, we're introduced to this man in the window that seems to be looking directly into her apartment windows, watching her. And we see the outline of this man, and we don't get anything else, just that he is always in his window watching her. As mentioned, Julie is left alone for most of the movie because her husband spends all of his time at his new job and he's schmoozing new clients. So one afternoon, she goes to the movies, and this man sits directly behind her. Mind you, this movie theater is relatively empty, and he sits directly behind her, and then he leans into her and then sniffs her. Ew. She leaves because obviously that is super creepy. And then she goes to get groceries and she spots the same man that was sitting directly behind her in the movie theater is now following her around this grocery store. Julia then goes home and she does a deep dive into the Spider, and we learn that he likes to put pillowcases and bags over his victims' heads and holds knives to their throats before he kills them. All the while, she is still seeing this man looking at her from his window in the apartment building across from hers and her husband's. She then meets her neighbor, Irenia, who seems to be this really super cool, carefree woman, and they form a bond. Also, a thing to note is these particular apartment walls, they seem to be very thin because we are first introduced to Irenia, who is screaming from her apartment, but then she starts laughing. So while forming this bond, Irenia shows Julia that she keeps a gun in her coffee table drawer in her living room that her ex gave her. So because Julia doesn't really know a lot of these people, and we have to assume that her and her husband have been together for a little bit of time, she confides in her husband on the things that she has been experiencing with this really creepy, mysterious guy that is looking in the windows and supposedly following her. So Francis, her husband, not being a man and being gone most of the time, tries to convince his wife that, maybe she's overreacting and that no one's following her and that maybe this man is looking at her because she is looking at him. Francis, honey, that's not how it works. So we learn that the man in the window and the man that Julia has been seeing around the city, his name is Weber. And he does live across the street in the building across from theirs, and he is taking care of his sick father. And there are two face-to-face incidences that Julia has with this man. The first is when Francis and a police officer confront Weber to see if he was actually the man that was following Julia. He is. And the second incident was with Julia and Irenia's boyfriend because they're looking for Irenia, who is missing. We also learn that Weber works at the club that Irenia works at. So Julie is convinced that Weber has something to do with her disappearance. So one night as the couple is home, they get a knock on the door from the same police officer we saw earlier. And this officer is now with Weber, aka the Watcher. The officer informs them that Weber files a complaint against Julia for harassing his father and following him. So for most of the entirety of the film, Francis is not convinced that his wife is in any danger at all. And he even pokes fun at her while at a work party, saying that the spider keeps her company. Shortly after the incident, we learn that the spider was actually caught, but Julia is not convinced. Julia then leaves because obviously her husband is being a douche, and she catches the subway home without him. Before she left, though, her husband basically told her that he can't take her acting like this anymore. So as Julia is riding home, she sees that Weber is also in the same subway car, and he confronts her, demanding an apology from her, because the first time that she is confronted with him at her home with a police officer, she doesn't really say anything. She kind of just awkwardly shakes his hand and walks away. But then Julia spots a plastic bag next to him that looks as if someone's head is inside of it. So she hurriedly gets off the train, and once she gets home, she starts packing. But before she can finish, she hears music coming from Irenia's apartment. Now remember, Irenia is missing. We have not seen her. And when she goes to see if her friend is home, she is confronted with Irenia's body with no head, sitting on a chair inside the apartment. Then that same plastic bag that we saw Weber carrying on the subway is now over Julia's head. And of course, as predicted, Julia was right about the man following her for sinister reasons. So he then pushes Julia on the bed, and she hears Francis's voice coming through the wall, but before that she can scream, Weber slices the side of her neck. So at this point, Julia is bleeding out pretty quickly. She's trying to reach her phone that's on Irenia's coffee table, but then she collapses and there's this pool of blood around her. Weber then lays down next to her, and we can assume at this point that Julia is dead. Francis then calls Julia's phone, and he hears it coming from Irenia's apartment. He follows the noise, and he sees Weber coming out of Irenia's apartment, but before he can turn to leave, 2 gunshots ring out and hit Weber, killing him. Julia then comes out of the apartment, covered in blood, and turns to face her husband. And the film ends. So I know that was a very quick recap. I usually go much more in depth, but I really wanted to focus on my deep dive, the explanation and my opinion on this film. I just think that the film is very straightforward. This couple, they move to Romania. The wife thinks she's getting followed. The husband doesn't believe her. There's this whole cat and mouse back and forth thing. And then, of course, the film ultimately ends with the wife being right. So I just wanted to preface that because I know that was a much quicker review than I've done on previous videos. But anyway, let's unpack, because there's a lot to unpack here. First, I want to talk about Francis. So when Julia first tells him of this man that is following her, he does give her a safe space to confide in him. He even brings her back to the grocery store to look at the camera footage, to get a good look at the man. But then as more people kind of start to get involved, his attitude toward the entire situation shifts. He starts to see how other people look at her when she tells them that a man is following her, and he sides with everybody else, and he sides with the police and his colleagues, even going as far as making fun of her in Romanian to his colleagues, knowing that she can't understand it. So it's you provided a safe space for your wife because she trusts you and she loves you, but then you turn on her when you start to see the attitudes of the other men that are around her. Because if you remember, when she's confiding in Irenia is very much be safe, be careful, look out for yourself. While the men in this story are kind of just you think that you saw him? Are you sure? I think that you're just really stressed out. It's no. shut up. Of course, we see that Julia was right with the last scene of the film, and I mean, how do you backtrack on that? How can Julia trust her husband after he clearly didn't think she was in any danger? How is Francis ever going to make good on what he did? He's probably not. They're probably gonna end. I guarantee you that she's probably moving back to the United States and getting a divorce, so... I also really liked Irenia, but it sucks that she was sort of like used by Weber to get to Julia. She was like a badass and like she did her own thing and she had qualities that Julia wanted and Julia probably would have possessed if she had a chance without a psychopath following her. Okay, so let's talk about Julia. She was doing right by her marriage by moving to a country where she didn't know the language or really anything about it because she wanted to support her husband and be with her husband. She was willing to even surprise him by learning the language. She was also very understanding that he had to work late to give a good impression to his bosses, even though she was terribly lonely. Julia knew that she was in danger because as women, we know when something feels wrong or off, or if somebody is like following us, if someone's watching us. We feel it in our bones, and there are so many like videos and articles out there alerting women to always be aware of our surroundings. So many women telling other women that if you feel unsafe to tell somebody immediately, and the case is no different here. What I liked about this film is that it was very straightforward. You didn't need much more than a woman being followed by a sinister being. Because even at one point during the confrontation with the police and Weber, I was like, maybe Julia is super paranoid and the idea of being in a new country is getting to her, but that was like a very fleeting thought because I knew better. I knew, as a fellow woman, that she was right. So Watcher was this very slow burn that built with tension as Julia got closer to the truth. The acting was also really great, and Bern Gorman, who played Weber, was super scary. There's also this interesting line that Irenia says when she's talking to Julia, and she says, "Let's hope you never have to find out. Having to live with the uncertainty, better than dying with the words of, 'I told you so' on your lips." So I think that's what Julia would have said in that final scene to her husband when he saw her covered in blood. I feel like she would have looked up at him and been like, "Told you so." I think what makes this film so scary is that it's based on reality, which is what I mentioned a bit ago about how women are followed and killed all the time. It also gave me a lot of Hitchcock vibes too, with the slow burn and then that final intense scene. So I know this was a little bit of a shorter review for you guys, but I really wanted to get this video recorded so that I could give it to you. And yeah. That's gonna be it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. My camera is beeping at me that it's about to die because that's just what happens. Comment, like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in my next one. Bye.